Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 97 of the podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about repetition in mindful movement classes. For those of us who teach mindful movement or yoga, I think sometimes we're a little afraid to repeat our sequences or the same poses week after week, but repetition can be really helpful for our students. Last week, I posted a short little video about this on Instagram, and I really enjoyed the insightful comments that people had on the topic, so I thought I would just expand on it a little bit and explore it a bit more here on the podcast. I also have some great interviews lined up over the next few weeks, so stay tuned for more guest conversations to come. Speaking of which, we are getting really close to the 100th episode of the Moved to Meditate podcast. I can hardly believe that. It's kind of a crazy milestone. And I've been doing this for almost 3 years now. And I just really appreciate you so much for listening to the podcast, whether this is your first time ever hearing an episode or you're a repeat listener. Thank you so much for being here. And for anyone who's ever shared an episode with a friend or all the different ways that you all have been part of this podcast so far. So I want to hear your voice on the 100th episode. I'm planning a special show, kind of a different show, with the theme of why we practice. And I'm asking listeners like you to go to my website and record a short message describing your practice, whether you do yoga or movement or meditation or whatever your practice is, and to just talk a little bit about why you do it. So maybe it's a few words on why you started your practice in the first place, or a little tidbit on why it's stuck with you over time, or how it's helping you and inspiring you these days. My plan is to showcase these messages and kind of edit together the little voice messages and recordings on the 100th episode. So hopefully a number of you can be on the podcast and inspire each other. It's really easy to do this, to go on my website and make your little recording. There's just a button you click and it uses your computer or your phone microphone to record you speaking, kind of like leaving a voicemail. And this was important to me, but you get to check it and even redo it if you want to before you hit submit. So there's no pressure like you're going to mess up and record something that didn't come out quite right and then submit it and have me put it on the podcast and then just cringe. That's not going to happen, right? It's okay. So you can redo it. You can fix it if you need to. And the tech is really, really easy to figure out. Another way to participate if you really don't want to hear your voice on the podcast is to just email me a response and I'll read it out. So just keep it short and share a little bit about why you practice and I'll read it out, because I would really just love to collect quite a few different responses and share them. So it's like this feeling of our community speaking and conversing together on this special episode of the podcast. The deadline to do this is August 24th to make it in time for that special episode of the podcast. And you can either record at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast or email me at mail@movedtomeditate.com. And the links for all of that are in the show notes as usual. And I'm also really excited to share that the Mindful Movement Teacher Training is coming back this fall, and registration is now open. MMTT is a live online training with me, as well as some amazing guest presenters, and it's a pretty unique interdisciplinary program that empowers you to lead movement practices from a mindfulness-based perspective. We emphasize accessibility and giving you practical tools that you can share in a variety of different settings. Some of our training graduates are leading mindful movement in schools. Others are teaching classes in local parks or in yoga studios. And some of our graduates are incorporating movement into their meditation classes or offering embodied exercises to their clients one-on-one in therapy or coaching sessions. So I'm really excited to gather this year's cohort. And if this sounds intriguing to you, I hope you'll go check it out and apply at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT. Okay, let's get into today's topic, which is a reflection on repetition in our mindful movement classes. I remember being a newer teacher, yoga teacher, and feeling a lot of pressure to come up with unique class plans and new sequences all the time, or to always be doing something different and interesting for my students. And I think I was a little worried about boring my students or having them think my classes were too basic. Maybe you can relate to this. Of course, it does take a while to find your voice and figure out what you really love to teach, and you've got to try quite a few things in order to figure that out. But as I've gained more experience over lots of years of teaching, and I've taught many classes and students of all kinds, and also getting to observe other teachers when I was running my yoga studio, I've learned to not be afraid of repetition. And of course, there are styles of yoga where repetition is a given because you're doing a set sequence in every class. This is true in Ashtanga and in Bikram yoga, just to name a few. Knowing myself, that is too much repetition for me, and I do have a hard time with the idea that someone has found the perfect sequence and we just need to do that one over and over again because there's nothing to be gained from varying it or building in other options. So I know for me, I prefer a balance of repetition and variation in the way that I practice and in the way that I teach. To use repetition in your classes skillfully, it doesn't have to be that extreme, like teaching the exact same sequence forever. But there is value to including some repetition, and you might be surprised how many of your students actually enjoy a certain amount of going back over the same poses or sequences. When I posted this topic on Instagram last week, one of the comments was from Karen James, and I wanted to give her a shout out because she was a guest on this podcast in episode 16 a while back, and we talked about creative chair yoga. So thank you, Karen, for this comment on last week's Instagram post, because she shared something really insightful about how her students actually gave her the feedback that they wanted to repeat the same class for like a month so that they could get more familiar with what they were doing and explore the movements more fully. Isn't that interesting? So I'll give a few examples of how I use repetition in my mindful movement classes and why I do think it's helpful. So I tend to start and end each class pretty much the same way. Not 100%, like sometimes we'll start standing up, and of course your students always groan when you're like, let's start standing today. But, more often than not, we start laying down in constructive rest pose, and we do a kind of a breath check-in, and then we start to do some movement. Usually the first movement that I teach is pelvic tilts. So there's quite a bit of familiarity to how I begin the class, and then the ending, the way I bring people out of the Shavasana or the meditation at the end, and the way I close it with a few breaths together. It's very similar every single class. So structurally, there's this familiar bookend of things looking pretty much the same at the beginning and the end of class. And then in the middle there might be some repeated elements, but there's also some remixing of things that are familiar and maybe some adding of something new or different, or combining things in a new or different way. And so the predictability of this and the balance of this structurally in the class can create a sense of steadiness. When students come to class and know what to expect, it helps create a container for them that allows them to relax into the process of the practice. Like, we know where we are in the process, we know kind of the feel of what's coming, we can just sort of relax into that process. And we also know that having this sort of familiar agenda and container in this kind of structural way is also very trauma informed. So it sort of helps to take some of the elements of guessing or surprise or, out of it, so that we can really just kind of trust what's going to be happening in the room. So that's one way I use repetition, is just creating that kind of familiar bookend of starting and ending class in a similar way each time. And then within the class, I also like to use a few of the same poses or movements quite often. And I use them as, this often comes up in like the check-in part of the practice or in the warm-up. Like, for example, the way that I use the pelvic tilts, like I mentioned, that's almost always the first movement we do in my class, because we're starting in that kind of constructive rest position. And then we just began to rock the pelvis back and forth. And I like it for some, practical and physical reasons. But just in terms of, why do I repeat it again and again? One of the benefits of that is that people can see differences day to day. When they've done this same pose or the same movement lots of times, it kind of gives them a baseline. So when they do it today and they realize it feels a little bit different, that gives them some information, because they have that kind of that baseline to compare it to. They've done it enough times to know, like, oh, this sensation in my back is new, or what's that I'm feeling in my hip today? And so doing that towards the beginning of class allows them to sort of assess things and to get some information about what they might need to factor in to their practice as the class goes on that day. It helps keep it from being rote, right? Because we don't have to always approach our practice the same way. We want to practice in a way that's responsive to what we're actually feeling. So that's an example of how a movement can help us to do that if we have that baseline from repetition and from familiarity of having done it before. I also like to think that when I repeat movements that are simple enough and I do them often enough, that maybe my students will practice on their own. I like to think that they will. I don't know if they actually do. I mean, some of them do actually come back and tell me that they did a pose or two, or that they did a breath practice when they were stressed out. And that really brings me joy. Like, I want people to take what they're learning in my classes and bring it into their lives and really use it. And so repeating things helps them to do that. So they can actually remember this stretch that they liked, or this simple movement that we do a lot. And when they wake up in the middle of the night and they're stressed out and they can't sleep, or, whatever is happening, they can actually fall back on and remember and do that movement or that pose. And it can become a real part of their toolkit. It becomes theirs through that repetition. So I think repetition can be really important at helping students to develop a repertoire and to make the practice their own so they can take it with them. I also really like to work with themes, and not just a theme for one class, but kind of an overarching theme that we might explore in different ways over several weeks. And this is also great to get your students interested in continuing to come back week to week, because they know that something's building and they're going to keep learning if they keep coming, just by the way. But, when we're working with a theme or, a series or something where we're exploring a topic for a while, we might find it useful to repeat some poses or some forms or some sequences to allow people to learn and deepen, right? So for example, the live classes that I offer these days are all series. I rarely do drop-ins because I just like, nothing wrong with drop-ins, but I just like to teach in this kind of series format with exploring a theme for a while. And we'll take 8 weeks or 6 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, a while to explore a topic like balance. Balance is one of the ones my students really, really love to work on. So there will be movements that are introduced early on in a series, and then we'll come back to them and review them, and we'll repeat some things the next week, and maybe we'll add in a few new things. So there's a balance in that between the repetition and the foundation it creates and the new things that we want to sprinkle in to help continue the exploration or introduce some new ideas and go a little bit further. I'm also noticing with teaching Qigong it really lends itself to seasonal themes because it's very tied in with the elements of nature and their seasons. So you can take forms that relate to the season that you're in. Like right now, I'm doing summer season forms and hang out with those for a while until the season changes. And then you move on to some different forms. And I might repeat quite a few of the same forms week to week, but I also might swap out a few just to keep it interesting and just to bring a little bit of, something else into the mix. But there can be this kind of in-depth exploration for a season or for a little bit. I've done that with yin yoga as well because like qigong, it's based in Chinese medicine and it has those kind of seasonal and natural based themes to pull from. Some of you might do this with, having an Ayurvedic influence in your practice as well. The possibilities are limitless. And with those series that I'm talking about, I'm not really teaching the same class every week, but just repeating some elements with an ongoing theme that we're exploring for a while. But honestly, I think I could teach a class today and repeat the exact same class plan next week, and it would still come out differently. I'll be in a slightly different place next week, as will my students. And I might find myself using different cues to explain something, or going deeper on one point over another point, or offering a different variation of a pose today because of who happens to be in the class. The timing will also probably come out a little bit differently. We'll take a little more time with this and a little less time with that, right? There are so many factors. So unless you are a robot of some kind, I don't think you could, even if you tried, teach the same class plan exactly the same way twice. So there's a repetition of a structure or repetition of movements or poses related to a theme, or repetition as part of your standard warm-up or closing. And there's also the quality of repetition within a single movement or movement form. There's some of this in yoga with dynamic movements like cat-cow, or maybe doing joint circles, or moving in and out of a twist or something like that, where it's the same movement repeated for a while. And this is something that's a big feature of Qigong that I love. And it's that, repetition of a movement, the simplicity of repeating the same gesture for a minute or a few minutes at a time. That kind of repetition within the class, within the form, can create a kind of flow that you can slip into because things aren't changing so quickly. It allows you to let go of the figuring it out piece and the kind of, let me make sure I get this right piece. So you actually just drop into presence and into doing the movement and to feeling the body in the form in a simpler way and in a deeper way, kind of more going into sensing than thinking. Okay, so now that I've shared a little bit about the joys of repetition, let's circle back to this tendency to want to avoid boredom. Boredom is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's just the resistance that comes up for us when we're doing something that slows us down or that has less stimulation than we're used to. If you want to feel calmer and more peaceful, you may have to be a little more open to that experience of boredom that can sometimes come up. And also, boredom is connected to the quality of attention that we're bringing to an activity. We could be doing cat-cow for the bajillionth time and do it by rote, or we can pay attention in a fresh way. Guess which way is more interesting, right? When we allow ourselves to be truly present, to bring a quality of curiosity to what we're doing, to be a bit in that beginner's mind, then the boredom evaporates. Everything is more vivid and interesting. We can see it with fresh eyes. What if you used the familiar, repeated movements in class to teach your students that? That could be profound. Our job as teachers is not to entertain our students or make sure they never feel boredom. Of course, we hope our classes are engaging, but teaching students mindfulness skills like being present, having a steady focus, being with what is in a non-judgmental way, that's a really different intention than just capturing their attention through novelty and stimulation and quick transitions and never having any dead air. We've all absorbed that cultural conditioning, but it's not great for us. Related to that, this may not sound related at first, but related to that, I've been looking at some advice on how to grow my YouTube channel, which is currently tiny. You can help me out and go subscribe if if you feel moved. But it's tiny because I haven't done that much with it yet. And a lot of the advice you see is all about how to grab and hold people's attention and use thumbnail images that have flashy colors and a lot of contrast and faces with exaggerated emotions. And you're supposed to edit the videos to do these like jump cuts and put lots of extra graphics popping up over top of the video. It's all like very stimulating and distracting, and it's just a lot going on. And as a mindfulness teacher, as a mindful movement teacher, I'm not interested in doing all of that because that actually goes against what I am trying to teach, right? So this advice doesn't apply. I haven't yet figured out how to work the algorithm without following the advice, but it just goes against what I'm trying to teach. It's contributing to the shortening of our attention span and that problem we have in our culture of just everyone feeling so overstimulated and restless all the time. So I definitely don't want that kind of strategy to kind of leak in or influence how I teach my classes. Forget YouTube videos, but how I'm actually with people and teaching classes or planning my classes. It would be unconscious. I would never do it on purpose, but I'm trying to be aware of, what are these cultural influences that are telling us, how to hold people's attention. So when I worry about people getting bored or how I'm going to engage them and hold their attention, I have to really look at that. I do recognize what we're up against culturally, and then I have to think about how I want to respond to that, how I want to contribute in knowing the conditions that are around us. So that's my little soapbox about boredom and side soapbox about YouTube. But anyway, I'm hoping that this is helpful if you've been a little afraid of having repetition in your classes. Maybe there's some ideas here that you can play with, and you can take this and reflect on how repetition has helped you learn skills or how it shows up in a useful way in your own practice. Then you can feel confident in how you are using some amount of repetition to help your students create a good foundation in their practice and then build on and deepen that. Repetition can be a beautiful thing. It's all about how we hold it as teachers and how we communicate it to our students. So let's go repeat ourselves. Just kidding. Let's go share practices that help increase attention spans and give people a break from constant stimulation. That sounds like a sigh of relief to me. Thanks so much for listening today and having the attention span to make it all the way to the end of this episode. I really appreciate that. And just knowing you're probably listening because you are a teacher of some kind or you're interested in sharing practices like that. And I just so appreciate you for your practice and for the good you are doing out there in the world. It really matters. Feel free to reach out with any questions or thoughts you have about this or any other episode. I really love to hear from you. So thanks again for being here. Be well until next time. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.